Okay, well, let's get started then. So today I'm going to be talking about Windows Phone 7 security, mainly because it's something I just found interesting and I thought I'd share it with others. It's obviously not the dominant platform out there, but I still find it quite interesting myself. So just to quickly introduce myself, as probably you already know from your program on that first slide, my name's David Rook. Most people tend to know me better as Security Ninja though. So either Security Ninja website or Security Ninja on Twitter. It's always interesting at a conference when I introduce myself as David Rook. People have this blank look on their face and I say, oh yeah, I'm Security Ninja, and you see a complete different reaction from people. I do lots of other things that I'm not going to bore you with now because I've got lots of things to cover, but I've released 2 open source security tools, one specifically for Windows Phone, so I'm going to cover that one later, hopefully both of them if I get enough time to do the 2 demos. So here's the agenda. So I'm starting off with, I suppose, a nice, easy introduction, looking at smartphone and a kind of smartphone app security. For you consultants out there, you can kind of think that as my executive summary for my presentation. But it's also to make sure everyone's awake at this time in the morning before we dig into the more technical details. So then we'll have a quick look at what Windows Phone 7 is. And then we'll look at the platform and application security. And there is a lot of crossover there because some of the security features within the operating system are designed to help secure your apps and your data. So it isn't quite as black and white as you see it on the agenda there. And then lastly, depending on how much time I have for demos, we'll look at both open source tools and how you can use those to analyze your own apps or, I suppose, other people's apps. So a nice simple big pie chart on the first slide, keeping it nice and simple. What this shows is the total mobile device sales worldwide for 2011. So there were around about 1.8 billion mobile devices sold around the world last year. And what might surprise some of us, particularly in this room, is that smartphones worldwide are still the minority. And you can see that that's pretty clear on that screen there, right? Out of 1.8 billion, less than 500 million were smartphones. And I say, they're a minority. It's still 500 million devices were sold last year. And probably, depending on the community or the group you're in, probably maybe everyone in this room has some form of smartphone. You might go down the road or into one of the other conference rooms here and maybe no one has a smartphone or less people have a smartphone. But ultimately, as security people, what it means to us is there's more people doing sensitive things on potentially, something that's basically a pocket PC. So you have CEOs accessing emails and so on and so on. So we need to deal with that security problem. But for me as an application security person, what I find more, more troublesome is the app side of things. By the end of last year, there were over 1 million apps available across all the major app stores. Now, in the real world, that means there are over 1 million available from Apple and Google, but I don't want to beat up on the others too much at the moment. But one thing you have to think about as a security person is there are 1 million apps there. How many of them were designed and developed with security in mind? Now, as security people, we probably immediately think none of them. And I don't quite think it's none of them, but I don't think it's many of them either. And that's really my generic smartphone, mobile app security content for this talk done. Just 2 things to think about there around, obviously, the increased use of smartphones and the fact that what I found from my personal experience is you can lock down smartphones for staff, but the second you try and restrict access to the apps they can access from the App Store, that's when I've seen people kick up a fuss about it. So you're leaving yourself open there. You allow them to essentially install anyone's software. So 500 million devices sold last year. 51% of those 500 million were Android, and we have iOS, Symbian, RIM, and then we have this tiny green slice for Microsoft at the top there. At 2%, I've actually been a bit too generous there because Microsoft had 1.9% of the sales last year. And what I found when I was doing this research was that meant they had a smaller market share than something called BADA. Now, I'd never heard of this before I started to do this research. So this is an OS Samsung developed, and you can get this on some Samsung devices. That actually has a bigger market share, at least based on last year's sales, than Microsoft have at the moment, which may raise the question of why should I even continue talking about Windows Phone 7 today? And whilst in one way it'd be funny if I just walked off the stage and went now, I'm not going to do that. I wouldn't want to give you a heart attack. Plus, I put a lot of time and research into this, so I am going to continue with it. Mainly because I think their market share is going to increase. Because what they seem to have done is looked at the things that have worked for Google with Android and looked at some of the things that have worked for Apple with the iPhone and tried to, apply some of those same things to Windows Phone 7. So they have the same concept of not providing the hardware itself. They're having other device manufacturers put Windows Phone 7 on their device. So LG, Samsung, Nokia. I think there's about 15 different manufacturers who are putting Windows Phone 7 onto their device. Now, there was an analyst firm, IDC. Now, last year, I think it was, they predicted that Microsoft would have 20% of that pie by 2015. And that obviously makes some people very happy, but in my opinion, that estimate is very unrealistic. Initially, it's unrealistic because it required them to get 5.5% of the market last year. And we know already they didn't even get half of that. But in my opinion, whilst I think 20% is unlikely, I think 10% plus is probably realistic for a few different reasons. I mean, the Nokia deal probably being the one that jumps to mind, but when you look at that 1.8 billion mobile device sales last year, in total, over 50% of them were Samsung and Nokia. So both Samsung and Nokia were selling over 400 million devices each last year, and both of them now provide devices that run Windows Phone 7. I'm not an analyst, so I'm not going to start making crazy predictions, but I think realistically it won't remain at 2%, but it won't get to 20% in, 2.5 years, in my opinion. So Windows Phone 7, it's the smartphone from Microsoft, and we probably all know that this isn't Microsoft's first attempt at having a mobile presence. In fact, I remember back about 8 or 9 years ago, I had a device from Dell that was called a Pocket PC back then, and it ran a Microsoft OS, which, if it was released nowadays, would probably be called a smartphone OS. They seem to have always been, the right kind of product at the wrong time. I'm not a Microsoft salesman, and I'll tell you later on, if you're looking at deploying Windows Phone 7 into the enterprise, don't do it. So I'll tell you that now before you might think as I'm going I'm a salesman for Microsoft. I'm really not. So Windows Phone 7, the OS we're looking at today, that was first released in late 2010. There have been 7 updates since then. There's an update coming in June, and then Windows Phone 8 is probably going to be coming Q4 later this year. Now, from a security point of view, Windows Phone 8 brings in some security functionality that Windows Phone 7 is missing. So a couple of things I'm going to point out that's been missing today in Windows Phone 7 are likely to be brought in by the end of the year. So Windows Phone 7, the OS itself is based on Windows Embedded Compact. So that's a combination of Windows Embedded Compact 6 Release 3 and some functionality from Release 7. So Windows Embedded Compact isn't just a scaled-down version of Windows. It's actually a separate OS and a separate kernel that's been around for about 20 years. And it was designed to run on resource-constrained devices. That's why it's been used for the phone here. And what I said, they don't provide the hardware. They're quite strict with the manufacturers who are going to deploy Windows Phone 7. So they have what they call the minimum tough but fair requirement. So every Windows phone has to have at least 4 gig of flash storage, for example. And one of the other things that I think, I almost said copied them, but obviously Microsoft doesn't copy other people's things. They like what Apple did, I suppose, in terms of having the central control over apps. So you don't have the ability to go and get apps from multiple places. It's either via the central Microsoft marketplace, or you deploy them to a developer unlocked phone through Visual Studio. I should have mentioned at the bottom there that what Microsoft have done here is actually targeted the consumer market. And if anyone has worked with Microsoft mobile OSs in the past, you would realize that that's quite a significant shift. Because in the past, they would have been very heavily focused on the enterprise market. But they've specifically taken the stance of Windows Phone 7 that they're targeting the consumer market. Now, for us as security people, that means there's functionality missing, which in my opinion, would or should stop you deploying that in an enterprise environment. And I'll cover some of those things a bit later on. So I jumped to this image a little bit too quickly, but if you're at all familiar with .NET development, ignore Windows Phone specifically for a second, but if you're in any way familiar with .NET, almost everything on that screen is going to look familiar to you. And Microsoft did that for a reason. If you were a .NET developer, specifically if you're a Silverlight developer and can do C# and XAML for the UI components, you are a Windows Phone 7 developer. Now, I said to Microsoft about a week before Christmas, Microsoft and I said, I think that's just marketing speak. I said, I don't think it's that simple. So they gave me a developer account and said, well, try it then. And I'll be honest, by just after New Year's Day, I'd had 2 apps published in the marketplace. It's very smart of Microsoft to do that, because every .NET developer is now potentially a Windows Phone developer without needing to know additional tools, because you use Visual Studio. Use Visual Studio straight to develop, debug, and deploy your applications. Everything on there in terms of frameworks that are used, Silverlight. If you're a Silverlight developer, you're definitely the exact skill set for a Windows Phone developer. So there's a lot of things that are familiar. And the good thing is for security people is that if you were familiar with reviewing maybe C# code and you have keywords that you might look for in the source code, you can apply almost everything you already have or everything you almost already have in terms of secure .NET development into Windows Phone 7 development, which again is something I like. So I mentioned .NET there, and obviously it isn't the full version of .NET that they're running on the phone. They use the .NET Compact framework. And again, like Windows Embedded Compact, it's a scaled down version of .NET for resource-constrained devices. So if you look at the classes you have available to you, you might think, well, it's the same as normal .NET, but it isn't. They'll have some of the same class names, but they've stripped out a lot of functionality. So like the cryptography class that people might be familiar with, you don't get everything that you would get if you were doing like a Windows form development, for example. And obviously you have mobile-specific classes in there as well. I'm just going to jump to the bottom point there for a second, because what Microsoft have tried to do here is try to make sure that you only used managed code, so code that's executed within the .NET CLR, which is like the VM in Java. But that's not strictly true, because there are ways to access native code from your applications. But for average Joe developer, like maybe you and me, we can't do that. And if you try and submit an application that does that, it'll be rejected. But the likes of Adobe, they can have access to native code. Now, I think that's crazy. I can't access native code, but Adobe can. Who's more likely to introduce a security issue, me or Adobe? But rather than go through those bullet points, I don't know, who's familiar with .NET or who isn't. So I wanted to just explain to you, in the .NET world, and this applies to .NET in general as well as Windows Phone 7, how your source code goes from your IDE to being executed. And it's important because there's a step in here I'm going to explain in a minute that I touch on very briefly much later in the presentation of how Microsoft analyze your code. So you can see it's a very simple piece of code at the top there. All that's going to happen is user clicks a button, it displays a message. So you go to compile that source code, and in this case it's C#, so Visual Studio uses its C# compiler. And in terms of Windows Phone, it's C# or VB.NET, so why anyone would write it in VB.NET, I don't know. So C# really is your only option, in my opinion. And in the .NET world, the compiler has to produce an output that's compliant with the CLR. So the CLR is the Common Language Runtime, and as I mentioned before, you can think of that as kind of like the VM in Java. Now that's why you can use Java in .NET, that's why you can use COBOL in .NET. Providing you have a compiler that turns that into the right format, technically you can use any language you want and run it in .NET. So the Java running in the .NET CLR, I think maybe sends some people's brains crazy. But there's something like 35 languages you can actually run within .NET, because it's all about the compiler, not the framework itself. Because what the compiler has to do is produce a managed module, which is a Windows PE file that needs the CLR to execute. But what what it does there is it turns your source code into Microsoft Intermediate language, or the intermediate language. I think it's a global standard now, but that's basically a set of instructions, and I'll show you some of this in a second. And then what happens when you go to execute your application, so you want to run it in the .NET CLR, there's a just-in-time compiler that turns those instructions into native code for whatever platform you're running that on. So I just want to quickly show you an example of that. So you can see at the top here we have that same bit of source code. It's going to display that message. And then we use the intermediate language disassembler tool from Microsoft. It's free, it's actually pretty handy, and you can see by the design of it, it's certainly not a new tool, it's been around for a while. So we just want to look at that button click event. And you can see these are the intermediate language instructions behind that button click event and display a message. And you can see that these two lines here, whilst we might not understand exactly what's going on, in the two at the top there, we can see that this is doing something with our message box, and this is the string that we want to display in the message box, okay? So by themselves, they're pretty useless, but the CLR takes that and turns it into native code and executes it, okay? And the IL stuff there, it's important to remember because we're going to touch on that a little bit later on, because that's important in the app review and submission process. So let's dig a little bit deeper into Windows Phone 7, and then we'll focus completely on the security side of things. So it's a 32-bit OS, and it runs in a 4 gig virtual address space. So that 4 gig is split into two gig allocations. One is for the kernel space, and one is for the process space. So the process that's executing won't get 2 gig to itself. The process itself gets 1 gig. And then there are common components associated with any process that's executing, and that gets another gig. And we'll look at that in a little bit more detail in a minute. And just to show you, I suppose, high level from apps at the top down to hardware at the bottom, some of the important things involved here in that architecture. So we obviously have our app at the top, and I'm not going to bore you by going through every single one of things on that screen. I can after if some of you are really that interested. But, you know, there are important things there. So up at the top there, we have this thing called cprog.exe. That's the thing that will intercept an incoming phone call and display the relevant UI components so the user can answer or not a phone call. And then down in the kernel space at the bottom, we obviously have the kernel itself. We have kcore DLL, which basically allows all of those components down there to talk to each other. You have the networking, file system management, and you have oal.exe down in the bottom corner there, which basically allows the OS and apps to talk to the hardware. Okay, so that's obviously a very high-level view of it, but you can see the split there between user space and kernel space. And again, just to show that slightly differently, the split, 2 gig to each one. Down the bottom in the kernel space, we have the kernel, the file system, and so on. And in the process space, we obviously have the code and the data that's executed and a few other things as well. And just again, to dig a bit deeper into the process space, as I said, the process that's executing doesn't get 2 gig to itself, so it gets 1 gig there at the bottom. And then up the top there, there's things, like I said, that are needed for all processes, so they get a share of the other 1 gig of memory space. So, security. You know, now we've had, I suppose, an overview of why I'm even talking about something with less than 2% market share. A bit more information about the OS itself. So now it's time to start looking at the security. As I said, I kind of split it into platform and application security, but there is a lot of crossover, and it might not be completely clear when we go from one to the other, because they do merge, they are interlinked. So the security model in Windows Phone 7 is based on a chambers concept. And basically, what happens is code is going to run within one of these chambers. So each chamber has a different permission set, right the way from, you know, where our code is going to run in the most restricted chamber, right the way to the chamber at the top, which can literally do anything it wants. And I'll explain each one a bit short in a minute. But basically, the chamber's there to enforce isolation. So apps can't even speak to each other. They can't share data between each other. Now, if you're coming from an Android development world where you've seen things like intent messages being used between applications, you don't get that in Windows Phone 7. It's supposed to be coming in Windows Phone 8, but from a security person, I'm a bit torn on that, because right now, apps can't access each other's data. They can't even speak to each other, which I like from a security point of view, but I'm sure that's a limitation for developers, and Microsoft are going to reverse that later this year, I think. But basically, there are 4 chambers, and we're going to look at one in more detail. But there are 3 chambers that have what they call a fixed permission set. So, you know, things like where the kernel runs, its chamber has a fixed permission set. It can do X amount of things. Fine, we'll touch on those briefly. But the one that I find most interesting, because this is where most of our code is going to run, is the 4th chamber, which Microsoft say is capabilities based. Now, again, if you've done any Android development, a capability is exactly the same as a permission in the Android world, and that's all it really is. That you say you need the capability to access networking functionality or read SMS. And we'll take a better look at capabilities shortly, so I won't spend too much time on it now. So you have these 4 chambers, the trusted computing base at the top. That's where your kernel, everything security sensitive is going to run, which is obviously the place where, well, depends on which side of the fence you are, the place you want to keep secure or the place you want to get your code running. Because if you get your code running in there, you can literally do whatever you want, even modify the security policy on the device. For the majority of us, we're going to be running in the least privileged chamber at the bottom, which is the one that I said is capabilities based. So you can think of it as the others have a fixed permission set, that has a dynamic permission set, because that's going to change for every app that we execute. So I'm going to touch on the others very briefly, and then we'll look at capabilities in more detail. So the trusted computing base, as I said, that's where the kernel mode drivers are going to run. And like I said, if you're a malicious code developer or a homebrew developer, that's where you want to get your code running, because you can literally do whatever you want. You can access any data, any resources on the phone. I suppose, then again, the good or the bad thing, depending on which side of the fence you're sat, is so far it's proved quite difficult to get your code running in there. But like any other security system, it's probably only a matter of time before it really gets broken. So only Microsoft can add signed software to that chamber, probably for obvious reasons, because you don't want everyone being able to put their code in there. Elevated rights chamber, again, in some ways is almost the same. So it can, if you have your code running here, you can access and read everything apart from the security policy. So again, it won't give you, I suppose, kind of a root access like you'd get in a trusted computing base, but it's still pretty powerful, because I mentioned before, you're not supposed to be able to see other apps' data. But if you got your code running in this chamber, you could. So again, only Microsoft can add signed software to this. The standard rights chamber, there isn't too much to say about that one, apart from if you have pre-installed Microsoft or OEM applications, they're going to run in here. And the one we're most interested in, or I'm most interested in at least, is the least privileged chamber. The reason I find that one most interesting is because any app you get from the Windows Phone Marketplace, and probably any app that, if any of us in this room are going to write code for Windows Phone or review an app for Windows Phone, it's very likely that it's code that's going to run in this chamber. So for any non-Microsoft applications, this is the default chamber for them. So like I said, if you get it from the marketplace, it's running in this chamber. So it's based on the principle least privilege, and it has that dynamic permission set based on the capabilities. So when you create a Windows Phone app, you have this WM app manifest file. And that includes a list of the capabilities that your app wants to use. So if you want to use networking, you need to declare it in there. If you want to read users' contacts, you need to declare that as a capability. Which brings us on nicely to capabilities and digging into them in a little bit more detail. So the first couple of points I've probably already covered, really, that if you want to access certain functionality, not all functionality, so you don't need to declare a capability for everything. So things like isolated storage, where you can write to the device and read from the device, you don't need to declare that as a capability. But for things like reading SMS and using networking, you do need to declare them. So when you create a Windows Phone app, you get this manifest file by default that has all of the capabilities in it by default. Now, as a security person, I look at that and think, that is a right pain in the backside. It has everything in there to start off with. And actually, there's no incentive or no need for a developer to modify that, because you submit that to Microsoft, they analyze the intermediate language of the code you submitted and rewrite the manifest file so the capabilities match what the code is going to do. And I'll show you how I address that as a security person in a minute, because if you're maybe a consultant or an application security person who has to review an app, the capabilities should be a good starting point. You can go and look at that and have, at least at a high level, a good understanding of what that app is going to do before you even look at source code. But not in the way that Microsoft have done capabilities in a way to help developers. And there are a few points like that we'll come across in this talk where Microsoft, I suppose, made a security trade-off to make security easier for developers. And that's a tough one for me. It's a bit of a conflict for me internally on that, because we always want the best security, but we should also be striving to make application security easier for developers. And I'll cover that a little bit more in a second. And there's a couple of asterisks on there because they give you a default list of capabilities, but it isn't all of the capabilities. They're undocumented capabilities, the kind of capabilities that allow you to use native code. You and me don't get them by default, and if we add them in and submit it to Microsoft, our app will be rejected. I did that a couple of times, and I was worried that they might block my developer account, so I didn't want to push it too hard. Because they take the analysis back to the intermediate language, and you have to include another manifest file specifically for native code access, I think it would be very difficult to get something into the marketplace using native code and getting it past Microsoft. I say difficult because nothing's impossible. And then the next point, I'd say that the Windows Phone app will give the permissions based on your manifest file. I briefly mentioned before, Microsoft potentially are going to rewrite your manifest file. So it's not necessarily the one you submit, it's the one that comes down with the app. Okay? And in terms of how they're applied, well, the capabilities are enforced at runtime, and they serve as the permission set for the least privileged chamber that your app is going to run in. Okay? Now, what I found interesting was if there's a mismatch, so if your code has functionality in it that it doesn't have a capability for, it'll still run fine, and you can do everything else the app offers until you try and do that one thing that you don't have a capability for. Then you get an unauthorized access exception. So, you might want to access a web browser component to show a web page, but if you don't have that capability, the user will see an error. Now, I remember trying to figure out how do I show you demos from a phone, and I couldn't figure out a nice way to do it. I was wanting to show you live from a phone, but in the end, I ended up recording a demo, so I can show you that in a second. And basically what's going to happen is I launch a basic Bsides London app. There's a button for capability, and what that tries to do is use the web browser component. I've not given it that capability in its manifest file, so you'll see the exception here in a second. It's a short enough video. And obviously, I'd encourage you to handle your exceptions a bit better than that in the real world. But you can see there, we've got that unauthorized access exception because we've tried to access functionality that we don't have permissions for. And I want to show you the capabilities in that manifest file now. So by default, as I said, you have this manifest file and you can see all those capabilities in there by default. Now the one we were trying to use there was the web browser component. So we were trying to browse to the Security Ninja website, but you can see here that that's being commented out, right? So we didn't have that capability. Now, one of the things I mentioned before was how the capabilities file for your application has everything in it by default. Now, as a security person, what you really want to find out is, well, what is it using? Because it's likely if you're doing a security review, I suppose you're going to do a review in one or two places. Maybe if you're a consultant, you're pulling it down from the App Store and trying to get the source code back and do a review. And I'll show you how to do that later. Or you'd be in my kind of position where you're doing the review internally prior to it being submitted to an App Store. So what I have here is a basic application I developed called the Windows Phone App Analyzer. So by default, you can use the app analyzer to run a couple of automated tools. So there's the capabilities detection tool, which is one of the tools Microsoft actually use during that submission and review process. This will launch that for you and analyze your code. It can also launch cat.net, which is a Microsoft security static analysis tool against its code. And again, that was what I mentioned before. Reusing those technologies is good for us security people. What it'll also do, and I'll try and show you in the demos later, is if you get the Windows Phone app, it'll decompile it for you so you can review the source code as well. So this one here this is the app that I just showed you. Now, if we click scan here, it's going to run the capabilities detection scan. And rather than telling us what was in the manifest file, it's going to look at the source code and it's going to tell us what capabilities are used. So you can see all we were trying to use, we were using Silverlight, and then we were just using the networking and the web browser component. That's all we were using. Okay? So that I found was useful to me anyway, because it cuts out trying to figure out, well, you've got 15 capabilities there, are you using them all? Okay? And we'll come back to that tool a little bit later on. Yeah, I'm not sure what it is. So yeah, application signing, I touched on it briefly earlier around Microsoft signing code to go into certain chambers. But ultimately, unless you're deploying your source code to a developer unlocked device from Visual Studio, all applications have to be signed by Microsoft. So again, they take care of that automatically for you. So during the app submission and review process, the very final point before they put it into the market store is they sign the application. And the app needs to be signed before you can install it on the device. Unless, yeah.
What's the sort of time frame for that?
When I submitted, it was 4 to 5 days, but I know they announced recently that it's gone up because they get more and more people writing code and they haven't staffed up in that area. So,
Apple, for example, they do it after the fact sometimes, so you can get a dodgy application in there, and then in the weeks to come they might pull it because they find something.
As far as I know at the moment, it goes through all of that before it can go into the marketplace. So at least that's what they're saying, that it has to be signed before they deploy it into the marketplace. And from my experience, that's the longest part of the process. I found what I think happens in those first few steps is that's all automated. I'm pretty sure there's just static analysis tools of some kind doing all of the validation up to that point. It was when I got to the certification testing that took like 3 or 4 days. The rest of it was like hours. So I'm assuming they are doing that manually and before it goes into the marketplace. But as it continues to grow,
Sloppy.
yeah, exactly. It'll get sloppy. So application sandboxing. We have actually kind of covered this already because we've talked about how our apps run in these restricted chambers. So our apps execute and run within the least privileged chamber, has a restricted permission set based on our capabilities. Now what that means for us, and I've mentioned a couple of these already, is that means every app is completely sandboxed in that it can't speak to other applications, it can't access data from other applications. And think about that for a minute. That means that you actually can't access data that other applications store on their device. If you want to share data between two apps, you need to store that off device. So in the cloud, or as, well, I like to say the cloud's a fancy name for the internet, but ultimately it has to be somewhere off the device, okay? Which is a little bit strange in a way. They can't speak to each other, they can't share data. And you might be thinking, well, you have the ability to read SMS and read user context. That can't be true. Well, there are special APIs on the phone to allow that kind of access. They have these things called launchers and choosers. So a launcher is basically an API call to do something where you get no data back. So a launcher could be send an SMS, whereas a chooser is a call to an API that returns data. So show me the user's SMS messages. But that you can't use those to access another application's data. It's very restricted. And in terms of data storage, they use something called isolated storage, which again, if any of you are familiar with Silverlight development, you'll be somewhat familiar with isolated storage because that's where the idea comes from. So every app has its own bit of isolated storage and it's supposed to keep the data private. As I said before, it's very similar to isolated storage in Silverlight because that's where they got the idea from. And what that ultimately means is that you can read and write data to the phone without having access to the file system directly. You don't get that access. You can only write to your app's isolated storage area. And there are 3 ways of doing that. So there's real basic kind of key value pair storage with isolated storage settings at the top. The next one down is isolated storage file, where you can create directories, folder structures, store text, binary or XML files. And at the bottom, you have the ability to use the SQL database. So that's SQL CE. I think quite recently there was a library brought out to use SQLite, but by default you can use SQL CE. So now that brings us maybe onto application security, because those are what I see as the key platform security features. Now I want to look at how you write secure code for that platform. Now, what I'm going to do, though, is take a little bit of a detour for maybe 5 minutes away from Windows Phone and onto mobile application security in general. And actually, I probably should have submitted a talk on that, but it's too late now, so I'm going to shoehorn it a little bit into here. Because in my eyes, mobile application security introduces no new issues for us as application security people. Now, some people have certainly disagreed with me saying that in the past, but I think when you really look at the problems we have seen and carry on seeing in mobile apps out there, I don't think there's anything new. There's nothing that we didn't already know about. There's nothing out there that we don't already know how to review for and test for. And I'm going to give you some specific examples of that later, so you don't just have to take my word for it. But what I encourage people to do is not just on mobile app security, but app security in general, is take a step away from the vulnerabilities for a second. Because if you get bogged down in all the intricate details of SQL injection or cross-site scripting or whatever it might be, I think sometimes you lose sight of what you're actually trying to achieve. And specifically when you're talking to developers, do you need to tell them about all these fancy ways of exploiting SQL injection, or do you need to tell them how to write code to prevent SQL injection? So I try and get people to think about the root causes behind common vulnerabilities. And my root causes, or I suppose the way to prevent those root causes, is the principles of secure development. So I have this list, so doing things like input validation, output validation, error handling, doing all those things right should prevent all of those issues happening in your code. Now what I want you to do is take a look at that list and think about 3 from that list, the 3 that you might think are the most important things that we need to deal with in mobile app security right now. Okay? So does anyone want to shout out what they think any of that top 3 might be?
Input validation.
Okay. Privacy. Session handling. Storing secrets, yes. So there's 2 of those are on my top 3. I don't have input validation and I don't have session management on my top 3, and I'll explain why in a minute. But privacy and secure storage in general are 2 of my top 3. So my top 3 is secure storage, authentication and authorization, and secure resource access / privacy. And I'll explain these a bit more in a minute. So I'll explain why I've picked those 3. So what I wanted to do is to make sure that I'm not just making this up by myself. I went and compared that top 3 to the OS top 10 mobile risks. I found that 50% of that top 10 were related to secure storage and secure communications, 20% to authentication and authorization, actually 0% privacy. I put an asterisk there because when I saw that, it raised a question that I've probably not asked myself in the past around whether violations of privacy and privacy concerns are application security's problem. Now, we're probably in the best position to spot them in that we're looking at the app, we're looking at the source code, but we don't normally, right? Now, if you think about accessing user contacts and sending them to a web service, are we looking at that from a privacy point of view, or are we just bothered about it using SSL or not when it sends them? I don't know the answer to that. It was just a question I had when I saw none of the top 10 covered privacy concerns, even though that is a big problem for us in mobile app security. So what I also did then is I took that top 3 and compared it to the OWASP Mobile Controls Project, which I actually think is one of the best things to come out of OWASP in the last couple of years. So that's a list of, I think, 70, basically a list of 70 things you should do right to produce a secure mobile app and back-end web services for that. So I compared it to that, and again, secure storage at the top, and then 16% rounding up, rounding down for secure communications, authentication, authorization, and secure resource access. Another asterisk there for secure resource access, because my definition of privacy and secure resource access start to get a little bit blurred at times, and I'll address that in a second. So what I also wanted to do then was go and look at, I suppose, the big mobile issues that we have seen, probably the ones that we've read about in the news, we've tweeted about, we've laughed about maybe at times, and try to look at the root cause there. And what I started to find was that, yeah, what we've seen so far is kind of supporting my top 3. So secure storage, I won't run through all of them because of time, but Facebook, a week ago, were found to be storing the user's OAuth token in the clear on the device with an expiry date the year 4001. Now, there's not a single bit of that sentence that makes sense in my head, but that's the way it was. LinkedIn, username and password stored in the clear on the device. Authentication and authorization. I want to spend a tiny bit more on the second 2 because I have to explain, I suppose, a bit about why or what I think they are. So authentication and authorization, I see that as kind of 3 different areas. Authentication and authorization in terms of user logging onto an app or putting in the PIN. Authentication and authorization to web services. And then I think more importantly, authentication and authorization for when you want to access users' data on the device. And that's why food spotting is the first one I put there, because they had this piece of functionality where you could tell them to go and find your friends who use that service. So you did say, yeah, I want you to find my friends, but I don't think it was clear what you were actually authorizing them to do, because what they did was take all your email contacts off the device and send it over non-SSL to their web service to try and find your friends. So I haven't got that in there as a privacy violation because technically the user said, yeah, do that, but I don't think it was clear enough to the user. Google Wallet, the top one was because you could brute force a hash they had on the device for their 4-digit PIN, but the second one I want to tell you about because I actually found it quite funny. They still use the 4-digit PIN, but if you cleared the application data on the device, it cleared the PIN and then asked you to set a new PIN. So if I pick up your phone off your desk, I can clear the app data and I'll set your new PIN for you and access your Google Wallet. So it shows, we might sometimes think of these things as, oh, no one makes those kind of mistakes, but, there are some pretty big names up on the screen, right? And if they're making those mistakes, how many of the rest of those million-plus apps have similar mistakes in them? And then for secure resource access and privacy, I'm, again, looking at this in a few different ways. Firstly, there's just the blatant privacy violation. So Path and Hipster, their default opt-out functionality of grabbing all your user contacts and uploading it to their web service by default is just straight up violation of privacy, Carrier IQ, I won't dwell on that one too much, but it was essentially a OEM rootkit. I don't think anyone ever proved that what it stored on the device was sent remotely anywhere, but it did log things like your keystrokes and a few other things. But the mobile ad libraries is something I want to focus on a bit more because they're potentially dangerous third-party code you're including. Now, people are probably aware, apps like Angry Bird. On Android, they're ad-supported. On iOS, you pay for them. You might have loads of different reasons for wanting to have ads within your mobile app. What you need to be aware of is some of these mobile ad libraries are pretty dodgy. So there was a piece of research published, I think, by a German university, I think in December, and I can give people the link, or I'll put the link on my blog later when I put the slides up there, where I think they analysed 100,000 apps in the Android marketplace, looked at the mobile ad library they used, and they found these libraries were doing all kinds of things. So you have the really common ones that, people like Angry Birds are going to use, where they're just delivering ads, and then when you start going down the chain a bit, you start finding ad libraries that steal your SMS, take user contacts, and this is potentially raising a question that we haven't probably really addressed as an application security problem already, about including third-party libraries and not being ignorant, I suppose, of what they do. Because if these libraries are included in your app and steal the user's data, who do you think is going to get the negative press? Dodgy mobile ad library writer or your app, which put it onto the phone that took the user's data? So again, you just need to be aware of that. And before, and you might have already done this, before anyone goes on something like Twitter and says, Dave Rook said you only need to deal with those 3 issues in mobile security, and from a few smiles around the food room, someone probably already has, that's not what I'm saying, because you still have to address the rest of them, but these are the 3 that I see as the biggest issues right now. Okay, so if you've got a back-end web service that other apps talk to, well, obviously you need to do input validation, You can't ignore the rest of them. But the problems, or at least the problems we're seeing found and talked about, are largely these 3 at the moment. But on top of that, because I talk about Windows Phone 7, and we can come back off that detour now, I didn't really have time to cover all of those issues anyway. So I tried to whittle it down to 3. And then I found that, well, 3 didn't quite cut it, because secure communications is also incredibly important. Because especially when you think about Windows Phone 7, where we're actually saying you need to store your data elsewhere if you want to share it with another app. So you might have to make requests over the web to SQL Azure, for example, from Microsoft. So I kind of came up with this new top 3 so I could include secure communications in there. So just data security in general. So secure storage and secure communications. We still have authentication and authorization. And then the final one I've changed to data access and privacy. Okay. So back to Windows Phone 7 and how do we address these things? Well, the first thing I always tell people is actually understand whether you need to store sensitive data on the device in the first place. And if you do, Microsoft give us a couple of things to help us there. So we can encrypt data or we can encrypt databases in Windows Phone 7. So if you create a new database, you can encrypt it from the very start. You can't retrofit encryption to the database. If you want to encrypt files, passwords, pins, and notice I said encrypt passwords, which should set off alarm bells in some of your minds, hopefully. We use the Data Protection API. So that's been around for like 13 years. Microsoft first introduced it in Windows 2000. It isn't the full Data Protection API, but that's what's used on Windows Phone for encryption and decryption of values. Now this is where we get into what I mentioned earlier around security requirements and making application security easy. Because what we're saying here is we can encrypt databases and we can encrypt values, but we can't do hashing. We don't get to select algorithms. We don't get any of the nice things security people might define as requirements for cryptography. But cryptography is made incredibly easy for developers. So this is where you start to figure out, well, which one is the most important to us. Now, before I jump forward, I will say that you can still use the normal system.security.cryptography class, but you don't get any of the ease of use, and you don't get some of the things I'll tell you about in a minute with Data Protection API. And to me, I think you'd actually end up potentially with a lower level of security trying to implement system.security.cryptography properly than use one of these. That's open to debate, obviously. So one of the drawbacks straight away is the database encryption is based on a password. So that means you have to have a password in your source code, okay, which is not great. But when they encrypt the database, it uses AES 128-bit, and they store the password hashed on the device using SHA-256, but as I said, that password's still in the clear in your source code. And this bullet point, I suppose, at the bottom is a little bit of a lie, but not for the reason you might think. You might think, well, it must be harder than 2 lines of code, but it actually isn't. Now, if you're creating a database anyway, well, for a developer, the only thing they have to do differently to get an encrypted database is add that password parameter on the end. That's cryptography taken care of for them in terms of encrypting a database. Now, again, there's a bit of a conflict for me because I look at that and I think, I love that. But then on the flip side, I think there's a lot of things I don't know about. There's a lot of my requirements not being met. But again, what are we striving towards? Good security that's easy for developers to do, or really high security requirements that we might never get right? I suppose it depends on who you are and what you're aiming for. So what we might want to do, though, is you might not want to encrypt databases. You might not even use databases. You might want to actually encrypt like a file or a password. You know, and I keep mentioning encrypting passwords because you don't get the ability to do a salt and a hash, not without using the normal cryptography class, which again brings in a lot of difficulties. What you're going to use is the protected data class and just 2 methods, the protect and unprotect methods. You can think of those as encrypt and decrypt methods, and they really, really do make this easy for developers, and I'll show you an example in code in a second. And that does encryption with AES, okay? So again, you don't get to pick the algorithm, but then there are a lot of good things there as well. Because what the Data Protection API does for you is it takes care of key management. Because you don't get anything like the keychain that you have in iOS. You don't get anything like that on Windows Phone 7. But if you use the Data Protection API, you kind of do. because it will generate keys for you and securely store them. And when you're writing code to do encryption and decryption, you don't have to know the key name, you don't have to know its location. All you call is the protect to unprotect method. Data Protection API takes care of calling the right key for you. And it really is that simple, and I'll show you literally 3 lines of code to store something encrypted and then to decrypt it later. So you can see these 3 lines of code here in our encrypt value method. So the first one is my super secure password. And then down on the second line, we're using the protect method here from the protected data class. We pass the password in, and that's it encrypted. The line below that is just calling the write data method lower down, which allows me to write to isolated storage. But that's it. There's none of the, I suppose, the normal craziness that we might be used to in terms of doing encryption. And again, you have to consider the trade-offs, but that does make cryptography incredibly easy for a developer, right? And then you see here the decrypt value method is just the opposite. We read the password from isolated storage, and then we use this unprotect method here, pass in our password value, and it's decrypted. Okay, so as I said, there's trade-offs there, and you have to figure out what's most important to you. Now, the next few, I knew I'd be running out of time, so I've not gone into quite as much detail on these. But for, on top of the time issue, I actually think the other issues are in more ways than the secure storage. I think they're more about good design, good security code reviews, and good testing. Because when you think about secure communications, regardless of the platform, you need to identify places in your app where you might be sending sensitive data, right? So that comes, in my opinion, down to design and down to your code review and security test and analyzing the code, analyzing communications data sent from the app. And that's incredibly important in Windows Phone 7 if you want to share data between apps, because I said before, you can't do that on the device. You have to go off device to do that. So it's likely that sensitive data will be sent over the internet to something like SQL Azure. So you can store it in a SQL database in the cloud so other apps can access it. Then the final point comes back to what I said right at the start about this being a consumer, not an enterprise OS. In that you can't use client-side SSL certs, so you can't do mutual SSL authentication. And there's no inbuilt VPN functionality either in Windows Phone 7. Which again, for an enterprise, to me, those are 2 pretty significant drawbacks in my opinion. So again, authentication and authorization, I think this is another one where it's more about good design and good review, good testing, and understanding actually what are you trying to do. Do you need to authenticate the users to the device? Do you need to authenticate when you go to the web service? And more importantly, when you access users' data, and it's always important to remember that that is the user's data, not your data, that you ask before you do that. And I know, and this final point says it, that technically we already did ask to do some of the things that users might not be happy about. So in our capabilities, we've already told them that we're going to read SMS. But think about it from another point of view. If you have the capability in there to say you read SMS, but then you write your code to read their SMS and upload to a web service, we've got members of the security press here who, what kind of spin do you think they're going to put on that? Do you think they'll say, and the 2 over there, you're shrugging, I think I know what kind of spin you'll put on that. I don't think you'll say it's fine because they asked for permission for it. You'll say XYZ company was uploading SMS messages, right? So again, just because you have it as a capability or as a permission, you should still make sure at least once that you say, look, I'm going to access your SMS, but this is what I'm going to do. Because, yeah, technically we already did ask, but I wouldn't recommend that as your only defense. And then data access and privacy. Again, I think this is one, actually, which isn't even application security specific, let alone mobile app security specific. Because you should already understand the types of data you use and access in your business. But where it becomes a bit different is if you already have kind of data access policies around what you can and can't access, where you store it, how you destroy it, you might not have included mobile-specific data in it yet. So make sure that you have these data policies, a privacy policy around all the things we should have for other data. Make sure they include the mobile data, and make sure that when you design, develop, review these applications that you consider those things as well. And lastly, one of the things I've seen lots of people miss is not looking at the data the app sends. They focus too much on looking at it from a static analysis point of view, just looking at the source code. You need to look at what is the app sending. Are they leaking anything that might tie those communications back to a specific device? We've seen cases of that happening. So again, don't just look at the source code. Consider looking at what it's actually sending as well. And then I've got literally a couple of minutes to show you a couple of demonstrations now. So what I said is on this Windows Phone App Analyzer, what it will actually do for you is if you have the Windows Phone app file, it'll decompile that and turn it back into the original source code for you, and then do some kind of keyword highlighting in there. So it'll draw your attention to parts of the code where you might be writing things to isolated storage. So this is open source, it's on SourceForge, and I know not everyone will have access to Windows Phone apps to test this with, so my 2 Windows Phone apps are also part of that project in SourceForge, so you can download it. You can look at my code and see if I've made any security mistakes. But basically, if you browse to a Windows Phone app file here, so this is my security dashboard app. So it's a .zap file, which is the format used for these apps, and click scan. What it'll try to do is it'll unzip the zap, because it's basically just a zip file, and then show us the contents here. So what we're looking for is security dashboard.dll. We'll click scan again, and then that'll decompile the DLL to give us back the original source code. So that'll just take a minute or two to do that. And then what we can do then is if we pick whatever source code we want, so within here, app.cs, click scan. It'll show us, in this other tab here, it'll show us our source code with certain things highlighted. So here we're right into isolated storage settings. So you can click on that and it tells you a bit more information about why that's being highlighted and the kind of things you should consider when you're looking at that. And then the other tool that I have is Agnitio, which you can kind of use in partnership with this, because you might look at that thing that's highlighted, but you might not know the specific questions to ask about that. And this is where you can use Agnitio. Now, I don't have time to tell you everything about Agnitio later, but myself and Tiago are doing a workshop this afternoon, I think at 3 o'clock. So if you want to know more about this, then come along to that. But it's basically a tool to help you as a security code reviewer, help you ask the right questions during a review. It does that kind of keyword highlighting again for iOS apps, Android apps, Windows Phone apps, and anything in Java and C# actually. And on top of that, it does all the things. Someone once said it was like a Mr. Muscle tool, because it does all the jobs that I hated. I didn't like doing audit trails, I didn't like doing metrics and reporting, so this does all that automatically for me, mainly because I didn't like doing them. So that's everything from me. What I have is, for anyone who has the best question, I've got a free YubiKey. And actually, the guys from YubiKey said before to me that if you fill in the speaker evaluation form and give it back to them, you get a free one from them as well. So whoever asks me the best question, I'll give you one, and if you want another, just fill in the forms, and they'll give you a free one for every form you give them. Okay, so if anyone has any questions, fire away, or I'm around all day anyway.
I've got a question around hello. So you are sort of advocating encrypting the data on the device, but if you're storing the password in the application, are you not just sort of obscuring the data rather than securing it, because you could just get the password from the app? Yeah. So,
I can't really say anything other than agree with you on that.
But are you saying it's adding something, or is it?
Having the password there, I think you're right in calling it obscuring it. It makes, what it means is if you take the database off the phone by itself, you can't access it, but I've just shown you an app that's going to give you the source code of any Windows Phone app, and you'll just get the password from there. Yeah, so it's not ideal by any stretch. Now, I imagine what you could do is actually retrieve that password from a remote location when you launch the app, and then include that and use that within the code when it's running, rather than hard coding it. I've not tested that, but I can't see why it wouldn't work.
Okay.
But otherwise, you store it in the code, then it's, to a degree, it's a bit of a waste, yeah.
Certs and the inbuilt encryption and the VPN, are they actually changing that for Windows Phone 8? Do you know?
I'm not sure. I know that Windows Phone 8 will have the disk encryption. So they're using, I think it's a BitLock, the same one as Windows 7. Same technology has been brought in for Windows Phone 8. All I know is that they're trying to bring in more enterprise features. So my guess is probably, but Q4 this year is what I've been told. So we'll see. Okay, thank you very much.